Hi all, and welcome to the lecture I was supposed to give you last week. Things did not work out very well for me at the end of last week, or even over the weekend, to be honest with you. So here I am on Monday, and I'm feeling a lot better, a lot rested. Everybody's better back at my house, and that's a good thing. So that means I can catch up with you. Again, I would emphasize that on Thursday I had planned to give us an article to read and work on, but I never gave us the article, so that would have been difficult to do anyway, and really you need to catch up on reading if you haven't, particularly chapters 5 and 6. So today I'm going to talk about chapter 5 so that tomorrow we can mainly focus on chapter 6, if that is okay with you guys. So let's get into it. In chapter 5, we take a huge leap from what we were doing in the modern period, in the Enlightenment, and we turn to what's known as the New Rhetoric. And the New Rhetoric, as I told you last time that we met, is really just kind of the old rhetoric, to be honest with you. When Grazi and others started talking about the New Rhetoric, they were really talking about going back to rhetoric, including reasoning. So, that split that Peter Ramus gave us, they have attempted to put back together. So during the Enlightenment, of course, we know that we had pretty much three schools of thought when it came to rhetoric. One, rhetoric included only the pretty flowery language like style and delivery. Another one, rhetoric was able to be a way of processing or reasoning out different things, particularly scientific deduction. And then finally, the third one, which said that rhetoric can't actually find the truth, only dialectic can find the truth, only science can find the truth, but rhetoric is the only way to share it. So we really had that tension between rhetoric and reasoning and the aesthetic, because some people felt that rhetoric really should just be pretty and attractive poetry. Others said poetry can make an argument, and some arguments can be poetic, and others said absolutely not. Rhetoric is only used to make arguments, particularly from both artificial and inartificial data. So it's a time when they were sorting out what rhetoric is. That might sound familiar to you, and it probably should, because we're kind of still there. Sometimes people use rhetoric in the sort of derogatory sense of it's just pretty language, it doesn't mean anything. We hear about politicians' rhetoric all the time, and it drives me nuts. Sometimes I'm sitting there watching the news and I'm like, that is the improper use of the word rhetoric. But of course, that's an academic thing, right? So in the vernacular, most people use it to mean either speech that we should not pay attention to or speech that doesn't say anything. Very Ramusian, I don't know how I would say that, but very much like Peter Ramus divided for us. So because of that, we study scientists and artists in the era of the Enlightenment. I talked to you about the belletristic movement, the beautiful letters, Hugh Blair, and others. I talked to you a little bit about science with Francis Bacon. Today I'm going to continue that just a little bit with Vico. We also talked a lot about argument, and we're going to get more into argument with George Campbell. So let's start with the science part, because I feel like we really did cover the aesthetic. You guys know what beautiful things are. I went into great detail about the elocutionary movement. I feel like I spent way more time on the aesthetic than I normally do. So let's talk about Bacon leading into Vico. Giovanni Vico, V-I-C-O, sort of wrote a response to Sir Francis Bacon. He said to Bacon, they were contemporaries, obviously. He said, "My dear Sir Bacon, you don't seem to grasp that what you said in with the four idols in Novum Organum, what you said is basically that there's no way for us to understand the truth, at least not wholly. In fact, we're always going to be questioning the truth." So he said in his work, which is called On the Methods of Our Time, that would be G Bentista. Don't learn how to spell that. It's just put G. Vico, V-I-C-O, a lot easier. Vico wrote on the study methods of our time. In there, he talks about the fact that Bacon, comes up with these ideas of faculty psychology, the new instrument of understanding where truth is limited and just saying, okay, as long as we know that, we're good to go. Obviously, the ideas of inductive in the Baconian method. And Vico really saw these and said, okay, so we're trying to determine for certain what the truth is. And as long as we use our new toys, I'm trying to say the word fandangled and I couldn't get it out. Our new toys of, at this time, we're really talking about like things like the telescope. We're talking about things like, we haven't even gotten to the microscope yet, magnifying glasses, some of the more advanced ways of looking at things to see more detail or to see further away or to broaden our vision. And I mean that in a very literal sense, because remember that we're limited by being human. So he said these mechanizations that we have, these new technologies, basically they fake us out. They make us think we know for certain what quote unquote the truth is. Now, Vico believed that there was a truth out there. He just didn't want us to be absolutely positive that we understood it completely because, as Vico says, humans are flawed. I mean, the four idols tell us that. It tells us what the limitations are and where they come from. And obviously, if you understand that there are limitations, then you understand that we can't know the whole truth. What happens when you become certain about something? Well, you stop asking questions. And Vico said this is really problematic. So on the study methods of our time, he presents how we used to do things like in the classical Greek period, and then he talks about how we were doing things in his modern time. And he said, we claim certainty, but what the classics and the ancients had over us was that they weren't certain, that they did question, and that in that questioning, there was an ethic to find out more about that thing which we thought we already knew. If you are certain about something, you stop looking at it. So if you're certain that you like a certain person or certain that you don't like a certain person, you're not going to bother to find out anything else that may make you change your mind. Or if you're certain that you don't like, for example, let me give you an example. I tried Indian food all the time for years. Every couple of years I'd go and I'd try it. And I didn't like it. And then finally, one day I went in and I liked it. Why? I guess it was the right dish to pick, right? So I always order that same dish, by the way, just so you know. But the idea that we would stop asking questions or stop looking for answers or better answers was a real problem for Vico. In fact, if you pay attention to Socrates, who supposedly said, and probably, somebody did, but this is definitely true, that it is in knowing that I don't know everything that I am a wise man. And for, to apply that to the general population, of course, he would never have done that. Plato definitely would have never done that. But Aristotle might say, don't be too certain of yourselves, because once you're certain, you stop learning. And if you stop learning, then you are no longer getting at the truth. And if you're no longer getting at the truth, then you are no longer practicing rhetoric. You're no longer sharing truth. And that's problematic for science and reasoning. So really what ends up happening is Vico says, look, dude, stop pretending like we moderns have something over the ancients just because we have little toys, and instead acknowledge that we need to keep questioning. And so that was Vico's argument. He is considered one of the first rhetorical scientists, or I don't know if that's the way to word it. Let me word it this way. He's considered the father of the idea of the rhetoric of science. That rhetoric, or that science needs to be explained to general populations, to general audiences. I mean, this is true. We see it all the time, right? We're like, oh my God, we put a rover on Mars. No idea what that means. I don't know how we did it. I don't know what it's going to tell us. We don't know anything about it. when that first happened. But all we do know is that it's a new technology and that that's exciting, and that it shows us pictures of something, and we saw pictures of Mars. Do we stop there? No, of course not. You don't stop there. You continue asking questions and you continue building technologies for the purpose of progress, right? Or I use medical examples a lot, as you all know, because you've been victim to my medical atrocities last week. So what do I do when there's a new medication that comes out? Should I use it? If I do use it, will it work? Well, they did these studies, and well, what do the studies really show? Like, is it really a generalization of a lot of different possible responses? And for a long time, I was told that, a current medication I'm on, this is going to fix it, this is going to fix it, this is going to fix it, and it's not fixing it. And so I started looking for people who felt the same way that I did, not so much for confirmation bias as just to say, is it legitimately like a thing for me to think that this might not be working? And it turns out, guess what? Hey, big surprise, there's a whole slew of people it doesn't work for. In fact, we find out that it's about 50% effective on what it's supposed to do, which is to impact a disease I don't have. We're just trying it to see if it will work on the one that I do. So that sort of experimentation is questioning, and that's good. But how do we explain these complex medical scientific processes to the general population? How do we make a PSA about skin cancer, about smoking, about tobacco chewing, etc.? Of course, that's gotten a little weird lately. I've been seeing the same sort of video of a guy who has chewed all his life and gotten mouth cancer, and how scarred and terrible his face looks, and which I'm less worried about looks, more worried about function, right? But that idea that we rely on not science but pathos, right, in a lot of ways, but yet it's representative of the science. Supposedly, right? We trust that it's representative of the science when we see a PSA like that. So now we've started getting to a point in our time where we just gloss over the science and say, that's too complicated, I don't want to know. And so Ernesto Grassi and others came along and said, guys, we should probably really question what's happening here and what we're being told, that we shouldn't just accept everything. Big shocker. Grassi really came after World War II, or really close to World War II, following it. And so this was a time when people thought that Hitler was a great rhetorician, which early career he was, later career, not so much, because you don't need to be a great speaker or to be a good rhetorician if your people are too afraid of you to even listen or question your authority. So unless there's a questioning of what the rhetor is saying, it's really not rhetoric, is it? It's more like coercion. So Grassi said, let's go back and let's look at really, Aristotle's idea of what rhetoric was supposed to be and how argument works. And once he reintroduced that to the discourse surrounding rhetoric, suddenly people were like, oh, well, maybe rhetoric is more than just flowery language or pretty writing or grammatically correct things. Maybe it does, in fact, make an argument. And maybe rhetoric isn't just written. Maybe rhetoric is also a part of an oral tradition of public speaking, as Aristotle said. And that's how we get to people like George Campbell. George Campbell said that rhetoric should focus on argument, but that it should focus on a certain kind of argument. You see, he believed in two different kinds of really argument, if you will. One was called deductive. And then don't get that confused with Aristotle's deduction. I don't know why they couldn't come up with new names. And the second type was a moral reasoning, okay? So the first type, deduction, is really what we call the scientific method now. Not hard. Explaining the deductive process that comes to a conclusion. The second, moral reasoning, was where rhetoric belonged. This was when we're trying as, a public or a republic or a community or on the mass scale to discuss and understand something. So here we're talking about public discourse. There are people who come up to me all the time and say, for the love of God, can you please explain to me what the impeachment process is? Or what does it really say in the Constitution? Or why do you do what you do? Good question. And so all of those things really require an answer that's sometimes based in artificial proofs like the Constitution, but also in artificial proofs like my interpretation of the Constitution and others' interpretations of it. So we get really into the public discourse and reasoning about moral aspects of our lives. And when I say moral, I don't mean good or bad or religious or non-religious. I mean, we're talking about moral in the terms of ethical. We're talking about moral in the sense of what society as a whole values and what we should do or not do about something. So don't be afraid of that word moral argument. We're not talking about judgment here. We're talking about discussion of what is right and good. And the other thing, the opposite is not necessarily bad. There just may be a small difference that, one is better than the other. And in the public discourse, we sort it out. And that's how we elect presidents. That's how we elect representatives and so on. So really, after Campbell, we want to introduce another guy. His name is Whately, Whatele, or T-L-E-Y, excuse me. And Whately was really, some people pronounce it Whatley, just so you know, W-H-A-T-L-E-Y. Whately was really about argument in the courtroom. Okay, so Whately introduces us to argument in the courtroom, and he says, okay, so we have these two opposing ideas, guilt and innocence, really, if you think about it. And he talks about two concepts that are extremely important. And those two concepts, and listen carefully, are the burden of proof and presumption. Now, I did not say presumption of innocence, I said presumption. So he says during the course of a court experience, we go back and forth between who has the burden to prove something true or untrue and who has the presumption that something is true or not true. So in a courtroom, if the prosecution presents a piece of evidence and the defense cannot answer it, then the presumption goes to the prosecution that that piece of evidence is legitimate and therefore true. If, however, the the defense has some idea of how to answer or deal with that new evidence, then they can answer it either by saying that the interpretation of the evidence is wrong or that it just was incorrect. And they could provide oppositional evidence or at least an oppositional explanation or refutation. All right. That goes back and forth during the course of a courtroom experience. We adopted those two ideas of burden of proof and presumption, but we added something to it that's different than the British system, which Whately was writing for the European system. We decided that presumption starts before you even get in the courtroom. And we know this to be true. We all convicted Michael Jackson, O.J. Simpson, Casey Anthony. We've convicted all of them in the court of what we call court of public opinion, like the people who think that they were guilty, whether we have the evidence to prove it or not. We just think that, and it must be true. But the fact of the matter is all three of them were acquitted in some way or form of their original crime. And I say original because OJ went on to commit more crimes later, which were undeniable. But did he kill his wife? That we don't know. And so there's this different standard also for what happens in the court of public opinion and what happens in a legal court, a criminal court. There's also a difference in what happens in a criminal court and a civil court. In a criminal court, you have to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that somebody did something in order for them to be punished. Well, in civil court, you only have to prove that it was likely that something happened. And so you might wonder, how did O.J. Simpson how was he found innocent in criminal court, but in civil court he was required to pay damages of an astronomical amount to the Goldman family because they thought he was guilty? How does that work? Well, it works because of that idea of presumption and who has the burden of proof. And in a criminal court and in a civil court, they're different. But those two main ideas from Whately are incredibly important. And you might be thinking, why are we talking about legal terms here? Well, we're talking about legal terms because the way that they're expressed is through the art of rhetoric, or the practice of rhetoric in the courtroom, but also because that's how we talk in the public discourse about our basic American system of judgment. We say, well, they're presumed innocent until they're guilty. We have whole television shows that are made off of that idea. So Whately is important there in the modern era because he and others then lead us to Stephen Toulmin. And of course, Stephen Toulmin comes up with the Toulmin model, which is in your book. I'm not going to reread it to you, but we could talk more about that tomorrow if you'd like. But the Toulmin model of argumentation, the idea of the three main points of data, claim, and warrant, are very similar to what Aristotle said. The additional of the three subsets of backing, rebuttal, and qualifier are important because in public discourse we add those all the time. So we change or modify our claim from something incredibly harsh to something incredibly maybe mushy. Okay, so that's how we end up having public discourse. And Toulmin he was a mathematician, as you know, and he really wanted to work on mathematical problem solving based in philosophy, that idea of proofs, and ended up really in philosophy departments and rhetoric departments here in the United States because we were like, hey, we need you to come over here and do that. He tried to make a model for how human beings reason publicly. I don't think that's possible, but he really gave us the closest thing possible. And we could talk more about that later. So in chapter 5, we're introduced to a lot of that as it plays out in the media. And the media makes a significant difference in how we listen to our presidents, how we experience the world. The TV shows that we watch actually influence the way that we think about the world. We've talked about this before with Gerbner and the cultivation theory. And now I'm going to really mess with your minds. I hope you're ready. Because during this time, we start to break down not just the relationship between reason and rhetoric, but also the relationship between language and truth. And along comes a guy named I.A. Richards. Ivor something Richards, but I.A. is how he goes by that name. And I.A. Richards came up with something he called the semantic triangle of meaning. And it's a triangle. I hope you know that. Okay. And on one corner, I'm drawing it for you in a very high-tech way right now. In the one corner, we have a symbol, which is, of course, a word. In the top corner, or in the top of the triangle, we have a reference. Okay, reference with a CE at the end, and that reference is our thought about that word or what that word represents. And then, of course, the referent with a T, which is the object to which we refer. Now, that looks like, in my very high-tech way, this. Hopefully you can see it. And you'll notice that there is a dotted line between symbol and referent. You gotta ask, why the heck is there a dotted line between symbol and referent, Dr. Dudash? Great question. Well, that's because, see, we know how we feel about something. We know what our thoughts are. We know how we feel about a word. We know how we feel about an object, right? We know that. We have that experience. But in between the word or the symbol and the referent or the object, that's actually arbitrary. And that is where the biggest thing for I.A. Richards comes in. I.A. Richards was less interested in communication, more interested in miscommunication. So he wanted to know, where does miscommunication come from? So this here, called the semantic triangle of meaning, explains to us where that problem lies. And it's between the symbol and the referent, the word and the object. You're thinking to yourself, wait, shouldn't that be the most solidified? To say, here's a word and here's its object? Yeah, except one thing, we think about it. Human beings are the most unpredictable things in the world, right? I say dog. I don't know what you think of, but I think of a 72-pound Collie Lab Dalmatian mix with a long collie nose, collie colors, a Dalmatian body. Everywhere that he has white, he has Dalmatian spots, boxed lab ears. I mean, short lab hair. He's a funky looking dog. His name's Corky, but that's not what any of you thought of. None of you thought of Corky. You all thought of dog in terms of what you think dogs are. You might have even thought about the old 1980s reference to a dog as someone who went around and did things that were bad, underhanded, or dirty. So, we use that word a lot of different ways, and your reference to it, your thought to it, may be different than the object to which somebody refers. Now, if I bring in a dog and I show you the dog and I say dog, we may be on a closer, we may be able to navigate that or negotiate meaning to a closer reference point, referent point, but we are not able to be in each other's heads and experience it the same way, because if you say the word dog to my Uncle John, he will freak out. He's afraid of dogs. I love dogs. I took care of some dogs last night because I had to, which is great, by the way, but, because I can't have them at home. I love dogs. He hates dogs. So when I say the word dog, he freaks out, and I'm like, I like dogs. I feel warm and fuzzy towards them. He does not, right? So our feelings or thoughts about just even the word or what that word might mean in a concrete sense is difficult. Imagine what happens when we say things like love, or girlfriend, or boyfriend, or partner, or whatever. I know this young woman. She was upset. She told me that her boyfriend cheated on her. I said, how did he cheat on you? And she says, well, we were dating. He called me his girlfriend. I said, all right. She goes, but he was talking to other people on a dating site. Sorry, I actually don't see a problem with that. And of course, that young lady got very, very mad at me, because how could I not know that if you say that you're somebody's girlfriend or boyfriend, that means that you're not seeing anybody else and you're in a committed relationship? Well, because the last time I checked, for me at least, unless there's a ring on it, thank you, Beyonce, there's no commitment there. Now, I don't mean that unless, physical ring. I'm talking about the metaphorical idea of a commitment. That, unless we negotiate, hey, we're not going to see anybody else, we're not going to talk to anybody else, I only want to date you and I only want to talk to you, then that definition of girlfriend and cheating varies differently. And so while she broke up with this young man, I was like, yeah, I really liked him. I don't know why you did that. That seems silly to me, because he was with you. If he was talking to other people, he clearly was sorting them out, but he was still with you. So I would take that as a more important symbol, right? But she looked at the words, and that was enough. So the semantic triangle of meaning really does outline for us how we miscommunicate. In the age of the media, media, what do we do with that? Right? Well, there's an extra layer of interpretation, because the channel changes the way that we see or hear a message. Marshall McLuhan said the medium is the message, right? In his first book, it came out wrong. It was typed, the medium is the massage. And he said, go ahead and leave it, because literally what the medium does is it massages the meaning of the symbols. Now think about that for a second. So whenever I'm listening to anybody on TV, or I'm watching a TV show, or I'm listening to a podcast or a radio, the message requires that the rhetor or the speaker or the creator do something specific to convey their message or their ideas or their thoughts or concepts or whatnot. And they're limited by that medium, right? And that medium can make them more immediate to their audience or further away. And you can really use media in various different ways to really mess with people's heads. Marshall McLuhan predicted, before there were even VCRs in homes, I know you don't know what a VCR is either, before there were DVDs, before there was anything like that, he predicted that we would walk around with little miniature TVs and we'd be able to say, hey, I want to see an elephant in Africa, and we pick up our phone and we're like, okay, there's an elephant in Africa. He predicted that a long time before there was anything aside from a car phone, right? Because cell phones did not exist, because how could a cell phone exist if we didn't have satellite to do it? And we didn't at the time. We barely had cable. Hard to believe. We've made a lot of progress in a very short period of time with the media. But McLuhan was correct. And McLuhan said, hey, listen, the way that media is used is going to impact how much work the person watching it, listening to it, etc., has to do, and how much work that medium has to do. And for we as consumers of media, some people say that we've become lazy because we don't question and we don't look into what we're being given, right? I mean, like I said, I open up Facebook and it says, are you an overweight diabetic looking for love? ? I'm not single, guys. It's been 5 years, Mark. I'm not single. Take that one off. The other two, sure, fine, whatever. Bring those on. Give me some medication commercials, whatever it is that you want to do, because we become that specific. We're like, hey, we know exactly what the audience needs to hear so that they will not go looking for more explanation. And that's what they want. How did that happen? Well, it happened because of something called semiotics. Semiotics is the study of signs. Now, what's funny is that semiotics sounds a lot like something else to me, and that's semaphore. And if you know what that is the use of flags to send messages, which I don't know how to do. But semiotics is the study of signs. Some people say that a sign and a symbol are two different things. Let's assume that they're the same thing for right now. I can debate that all day, but let's assume that symbols and signs are the same thing. So take that symbol from I.A. Richards right here, and that's a sign. Okay, it does something. What does it do? This is the definition of a sign. Now, it's a mathematical equation, so I apologize, but this is the definition of a sign. A sign equals the signifier over the signified. This means that the signifier is more important than that which it signifies. Now, you might be thinking, what the hell does that mean? Well, let me tell you. How many of you have ever been in a room with an elephant? Maybe not everybody. Probably not everybody. If you've not been in a room with an elephant, you will think about an elephant very differently than those who have been with an elephant. If you've never traveled to certain parts of the world, you will think about those parts of the world differently than others will, because we have stopped having the real experience with things that are signified, and we're focusing on signifiers. We are focusing on narrative, on the story, on the words and the symbols that are being shared with us, rather than what they actually mean. You might be thinking, well, that's just the definition of fiction, Dr. Dudash. You're right. It is the definition of fiction. But it's also the definition of words, because symbols and signs are arbitrary. So if I say to you, hey, everybody, you know what rhetoric is, right? You'll be like, yeah, I know what rhetoric is. Some of you will give me the definition according to Aristotle. If I say to you, hey, have you ever been on a safari, or do you know what a safari is? You'll say, yeah, I know what a safari is, but have you ever been on one? No. Well, how can you talk about that which is signified with the signifiers if you don't know the signified, right? But we do this all the time. We think that we understand how the words relate to the thing we're talking about. And we don't. And that line in between the two that places this signifier over the signified means that we're living in a world created by language for the most part. We've talked about this before. We've talked about the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis. I think it's still called that. I'm not sure. But the idea that language creates our reality. And I've told you before, I believe that language impacts our reality, how we perceive it, but it doesn't change reality. Okay? The Constitution isn't changing. The words on the paper are not changing. But our interpretations of those words on that paper do change. So in chapter 5, what we start getting is that the separation of the signifier from the signified is really somewhat, at least, based in the media. The media removes those two things and says, hey, you've had this experience, right? I mean, how many of us have fallen in love with a vampire? All of us, right? We've all fallen in love with a vampire. Why? Because we've seen him on TV? Then we know what a vampire is, right? Yeah, except they don't really exist, right? I mean, David Boreanaz exists, but an angel doesn't exist. Sorry, that's the closest reference I've got to a vampire right now, I think. Yeah. Tyler Lautner? No, that was a werewolf. You get the idea, right? So what we have is a way of thinking about things that are out there, ideas that are out there, without ever experiencing them, and instead just experiencing the words, the signifiers. Now, this is problematic enough when we talk about, have you ever been on a train? Have you ever ridden an elephant? Have you ever gone to a rodeo? That's hard enough, but because people are like, oh yeah, I know what a rodeo is like because I watched one on TV. That it's not the same. It's a completely different experience when you're there. Like hockey. Hockey can only be experienced if you're there, right? So like that idea, you don't have to agree with that statement, but that idea that we're separating what we're seeing and what we're interpreting with that which we actually experience becomes problematic for some people. And that's what chapter 5 is all about. That's what chapter 5 is all about. Now imagine what happens when we start talking about things like love or peace or justice or politics, which don't have concrete referent points. What do? We interpret. So now we're interpreting signifiers. And that's where confusion comes in. That's where miscommunication comes in. And that breakdown between the signifier, the word, the object, the symbol with the signified, the object, the concept, the idea, that breakdown really causes a lot of problems for people. I mean, when I say love, I love you. Well, that's a pretty abstract concept, isn't it? Shouldn't we negotiate that meaning a little bit before we just dive into what we think is happening? So I'm sorry to use a dating example there, but that's a fact. Abstract concepts are more difficult to negotiate meaning than concrete concepts, which is why we always say use concrete language when you're trying to explain something, right? But we can't ever completely express the experience from one person to another. So when we watch TV, we feel powerful or we feel sad. We cry at things that aren't true. We laugh at things that aren't true, sometimes that aren't funny. We can watch blood and gore maybe because we know it's fake, but to some people it's just too real. I mean, me prior to the age of 26 could not watch anything with blood in it. Now I'm like, show me whatever. Because that separation between what is real and what is fictional and presented to me was a little fuzzier back then. And that's not a bad thing, by the way. That's okay. But we have to recognize that, and that's where critical thinking comes in. And we say, okay, what's really happening on that TV screen, and what is it telling me? Or what's really happening in this blog, and what is it telling me? Or what's really happening in this thing that I'm reading or looking at, and what does that mean? That puts us in a position of critical theory, which is something that we're going to talk about more a little later. Meanwhile, that is chapter 5. Start reading chapter 6. If you haven't read chapter 5, go back and read chapter 5, and then read chapter 6. And I will see you tomorrow.